Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. We're just going to get started here in a few moments. But just thank you so much for coming to our first panel for In Our Code, and welcome to Unit London. And so we're so excited for the showcase that's downstairs. So if you haven't taken a look, take some time after the panel. We have 11 generative artists, generative artworks in the showcase, and it's really been an act of love to put this on with all of you. And so today, with our panel, I'm just going to do introductions really quickly. We have 3 artists from the showcase that have traveled to London, and we're very grateful to have all 3 of you. So we have Iskra Velitchkova, and we have your work downstairs, which is Lines and Bones, a study of distance. We have Sofia Crespo, who is our AI artist representing here tonight, and she has a beautiful digital work as well as a cyanotype print. And then we have William Mapan, who has 4 pieces on display downstairs, one that's a triptych, and then as well as another work, Teleshama. And then we have Douglas Dodds here, as well, who is the former Senior Curator at the V&A. And I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you, because he wrote the foreword in our pamphlet, as well as did a exhibition walkthrough with us. And you've really been a pioneer in this space, and championing generative art from the 1960s and onwards in these exhibitions, and really put a place in our history for us. And then our moderator, I wanted to take a moment to brag for you and Right-Click Save. So Alex is the editor-in-chief of Right-Click Save, which has really pushed forward academic writing in this space, and kind of putting in criticism and as well as press reviews and exhibition reviews that's really needed in this space. And so I just wanted to get you guys started. And so we'll be talking about various topics tonight with generative artists, and I'll let Alex get started.
Yo, can you hear me? Good evening, everyone. We're here to celebrate, I think, what's been a year of really an explosion of interest in what I think I can call generative art. I noticed Abigail used the phrase AI art, and I think it's probably important to stress at this point that one of the reasons I don't have reviews on our magazine is that to have reviews presupposes that you have a way of evaluating digital art. You have a kind of critical system, a language, etc. But the reality is that language is emerging, in part because the NFT changed everything, I think, for the development of generative art. And I think there's probably a question one would pose as to whether we would be sitting here without the NFT, although the NFT is not principally the reason we are here. I think there's also something going on both in London and the art world in general. I think, and this is something that's particularly lively at the moment because we just had the Ethereum merge, which means that Ethereum just got a whole lot greener. And of course that removes one of the arguments that was often leveled against art tokenized and digital art in general. And over the course of the year, we've had new collaborations between the mainstream contemporary and crypto art world. So we had a partnership between Pace Verso, which is the digital arm of Pace Gallery, and Art Blocks, which is a generative art platform. We had Marina Abramovic minting her first NFTs. And because there's been this crypto crash this year, we've also had a lot of the hype drain away that was one of the arguments people often used against digital art, was that it was really a speculative vehicle. But of course, if the market's tanked, why are we still here? And the reason, of course, is that, there's a lot of thought, skill, imagination that goes into work produced by these artists. I think also using a phrase like generative art might make the work that these artists produce seem marginal. But I think what we've seen this year is that the crypto and mainstream contemporary arts are kind of merging. It's not a kind of easy process, but it's something that I think is undeniable. And I think one of the ways that I can say quite categorically that these are not only the leading generative artists, but some of the leading artists in the world, is because especially William, is principally because art made using algorithms is a very old thing. Sol LeWitt was writing instructions in the late 60s for people to execute his works. That wasn't digital, it was analog. But Sol LeWitt is not regarded as a computer artist, he's regarded as a mainstream contemporary artist. But he foreshadows the artist here today. On the other hand, and this is something that Douglas is probably the most specialized to talk about, there's a long history of computer art. And I would suggest that these artists also sit within that history. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there are two parallel threads in what you could call art history, which have been separate probably until the NFT, and now have merged or are merging in a sort of uncomfortable but also quite exciting way. So where to start? In other words, this is very exciting. I think one of the interesting things, particularly about this exhibition, is that it exhibits work which is what you might describe as born digital, which is to say that it starts as code, or it starts in a digital context. It's natively digital, but it's exhibited in a physical context. Of course, a lot of you guys, if you're collectors, will probably be perfectly happy to display works on a phone, perhaps on a screen. But what's clear, I think, also is that works that we see downstairs and also elsewhere in London recently, I'm thinking of Philip's show of generative art in particular, shows that actually work that starts out as digital often works very well in a physical context. And that is something I think these artists probably also feel strongly about, and that's something that comes across downstairs. So I think the idea of digital art being displayed in a physical context is not a contradiction in terms. In fact, the physical reality, I think, of a lot of these works is that they sit actually probably best within the history of painting rather than the history of perhaps computer art. But that's just one position, a provocation, perhaps. So I think probably the most appropriate person to start with is Douglas. And I wonder whether, Douglas, you collected a lot of computer art for the V&A at a time where it wasn't so sexy. And I wonder if you could perhaps just share your thoughts with the audience on what it feels like for you at this point for the kind of pennies dropped.
Well, to be honest, it's fantastic to have such a wonderful audience here tonight listening to this talk and engaging with the subject, because certainly 15, 20 years ago, there wasn't a lot of interest outside a very small group of people. So, we've gone from a situation in the 1960s, going back a very long way, when hardly anybody made any money out of this, to a situation now when many people are able to make a living as an artist. And that's quite a big deal, for the artists, obviously, but for the whole ecosystem, like the galleries as well. So I'm absolutely thrilled by it, of course, and really glad that it's developed in the way that it has. But the reason why I thought it was important for a major museum like the V&A to collect the history of it was because it just seemed to me that it was obviously a new revolution, like the switch from medieval manuscripts to printing, or the Industrial Revolution. It was just a major moment. And, the art world, even though many people in the wider world weren't aware of it, there were people in the art world already engaging with that in the early days. So in the introduction to the catalogue, I refer to some of those very early artists, people like Frida Nark, Georg Nies, Michael Knoll, most of whom were actually mathematicians or engineers. They weren't trained artists. They didn't go to art school. It was only a few years later when the first real artists started to engage with this sort of stuff. And, 2 or 3 of them were actually really successful at it and still are. Vera Molnar, who's extremely well known, Manfred Moore, Harold Cohen. There's a Harold Cohen show about to open here in London in a few weeks' time. So, suddenly there's a massive interest in that history of it. And it's mainly encouraged by the interest in the current NFT space and, the massive interest that there is there.
Thank you. I want to start with Iskra, if I may. Would you be able to introduce your work for the show, and perhaps say something about this relationship between the output that we see and the input, which is something I think that's part of the kind of conversation here?
Yes, well, I'm Iskra Velitchkova. I'm presenting here Lines and Bones, which is a project that I think I use this project to start like a whole conversation that I was trying to express for the last year. And I think this was a very great opportunity since the exhibition speaks about this output, input, physical, digital, and I thought it was a great place to put it here. The piece is something that really speaks about this thing that we are talking now. It's like tries to express this kind of capacity that today technology can bring to the space. I mean, if we look at the pioneers or the mathematicians or the engineers who really built all these things that we are playing now with, I think it's about they just gave us the tools. And it's not about bringing only digital work with these tools. It's using this huge new intelligence, which for me is different from the beginning of everything. I mean, doing art with technology can, allow you to do a perfect line, and that's something very interesting in terms of maybe doing something artistic. But there is something on the top of that, which is something that we can do now, and it's, I don't know if I want to draw a line. I have maybe some question, I code something, and then the machine gives me, this is gonna be a rect, or thousands of rects, and that new drawing, it's something that you weren't expecting to obtain with your first idea. So this is something that I really wanted to express with the work. It's a work based on 5 lines of code. Like I really wanted to do that in something that I can memorize, actually. I know my code. And if you change like the shape, you obtain a human eye or a camera objective, which is all around this concept of eye-ness. It's something that I don't know if it exists in English, but it should, because it's a nice word. And it's about this, the eye as this proxy between ourselves and the world around. And yes, it's not a message. This work just pretends to open a conversation around how we look around, how this technology can unlock things that we see or we observe, but actually we cannot see, or something like that. So there is something that maybe the machines can tell us. And that's why the work is physical, because really it doesn't have to be digital. And then I put a GIF next to the work, which is digital, because it brings this sense of motion that the physical piece cannot allow me. So I try just to use the medium if I really needed to use that. And then I connected to the piece a letter that really, it's a letter to Malevich, because I thought I really needed to go to the roots of some previous people who really brought to us this new field to play. And he was someone that really wanted to go to the deep things, to the truth, to what is a color, what is a shape. And that's something that I think we all share this interest for understanding the truth. But he also, if I understood well, he was against technology, because he thought, the human was more important than the machine. And I think that's true, but I really, tried to get a hypothetical conversation with him, telling him that's true, but now we have this thing that it's not gonna remove our human power, but maybe it can help us to think bigger. And that was something that I wanted to tell him. And next to the letter, there are 2 napkins where I wrote the code, because it's like a simple expression of you can write it on a napkin. And also, all the things that we can create today, it's not because we have a computer, but you can look around in the nature, you can be inspired by the sea, and that was my case, and you can just write it in a bar in Spain in summer, drinking a beer, and you can open a whole project doing this exercise. And this is all.
Sofia, same question to you.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm Sofia Crespo. The work that we're showing here is a work particularly about microscopy. At least to me, that's one of the things that it talks about. I got my first microscope when I was 8 years old, and to me that changed a lot the way that I see the world, because suddenly there was this whole kind of life that it was just not accessible to my naked eye. And it opened me to also life forms that exist at a very different pace. It seems like everything under the microscope moves on a different kind of time scale. It moves very fast. And I found that really fascinating. So with time, I started to think more and more about this, and I started to buy different microscopes and play with different techniques. And through my work, well, at some point I discovered that you could actually use AI algorithms to make art, which was like, what? I can't believe that you can actually do that. I thought only corporations had access to AI, and that it was a thing that was kept away from the public. And I started to use convolutional neural networks in particular to extract patterns from images. So in this case, I took images from drawings that Haeckel made, particularly about a type of microscopic life that they're called protozoa. And they are called protozoa because they're seen as like the proto kind of life forms, the simplest life form. But this is an idea from the 1800s, like going on expeditions and actually looking at these life forms and really not understanding them. And radiolaria are one type of protozoa. I'm not gonna give a full biology lecture, don't worry. But they're fascinating because they actually have silica skeletons. And suddenly I was like, there's this microscopic life form that has silica skeletons, and somebody has been illustrating that in the 1800s. And he talks about how difficult they were to illustrate because this skeleton was dissolving when he took them out of like the water and observed them in the microscope. So it's this whole kind of thing that's very, it's kind of like escaping you. It's not easy to observe. And I felt like, well, there's something really powerful about using AI to extract patterns from these life forms and see them in a different way. And simultaneously, I'm really, really inspired by Anna Atkins. Maybe many of you know her work. She was the first person to publish a photography book. And her works are actually at the Natural History Museum here. If you're into that, I really recommend you to see them. And there's this woman who is a botanist and is, for the first time, finding this new way of rendering algae and rendering this plant life that she had observed, which before always had to be illustrated because there was no, like, photography wasn't mainstream. And so it's just, I was really, really inspired by that, and I felt like I really wanted to reference to her work. So actually the first collector who commissioned cyanotype from me is here. And after that cyanotype, I really I felt like I wanted to continue there. I only made 3 cyanotypes, and this is the third one in fabric. I made lots of cyanotypes on paper, but fabric is a completely different kind of medium to work with. And yeah, well, I don't want to keep taking all the time, so.
And William.
Hi, I'm Mapan. My artwork is actually triptych. It's called Murmure d'un carré. So in English, it whispers of a square. And the whole idea when Unit London approached me about this relationship between the input and the output, I quite found this interesting because usually I like to translate my emotions sort of into my code. So I really believe if you do the same thing every day, you will have a different output because it depends on your environment and your emotions. And this time I wanted to translate more of my humanness in how I observe the world, basically, and how I can put a different angle of view onto something really simple. And this thing simple was a square, like the very basic thing of a computer, like pixels on the screen. And I was like, how can I make it talk or open a dialogue with this square? And for some reason, I remember this poem from my childhood because I had such a hard time to remember it, but now it's all in my head all the time, from Paul Verlaine, and it's all about guessing through whispers. So it's all about outlines and blurriness and how everything blends in between. And I decided to interpret, to observe this poem and give it to the algorithm, and how the algorithm can then talk with me and to us through it. So the whole idea was to make it talk, and the more it talks, the more color you'll see on the screen. So that's why the first one is very blurry and monochrome, and the more you go to the third, the more color emerges. And this is all about this relationship, how something you thought it was quite rigid or quite sharp, like a rectangle, a pixel, can suddenly evolve into something more human. And I think that's also our role as artists, to observe the world around us and see it under another angle, how we can interpret all that. So yeah, that was the message. And yeah, basically that's it.
Thank you. Douglas, I wonder whether you have any initial responses about this particular triptych today. All of their works, which seem to me to be incredibly diverse.
Yeah, absolutely. Where to start, really? The first thing that occurred to me was your napkin. And you remember that story about the artist like Picasso trying to pay for his dinner with a napkin, and they turned him down. I was kind of wondering if it was ever going to get to the stage where you should, you see, whether you would be able to get your dinner for the cost of the napkin. So that was one thing that passed through my mind, but also the sequencing of your work and the way in which you portray it on the wall. Some of you probably haven't seen the exhibition yet, but there is this sort of display of, is it 8 images, and it's just the way it flows from one to the next is really nice. They're like stills, aren't they? Almost a movement from one to the so that was really nice. And your work, I'm really struck by that as well because of the natural history element, and that relationship. A lot of artists have actually worked with that that sort of input. I'm thinking of Darcy Thompson as well. I don't know if you know his work, but many artists were inspired by that to create digital works, because it's that same sort of sense of emergence going on, which is similar to what happens in a generative art sort of space. And then, William, your work is fabulous, not least because it has such a sort of physical presence. You know, you can almost feel the screen on some of those works, because it looks like it's made with graphite. You know, it's got that very, very delicate, slightly blurry, as I think you say, feel to it. And for me, that's actually quite an interesting aspect of this medium. I quite like to see physical things as well as the screen, as well as the thing online. So, you know, having an exhibition like this in a physical space is actually quite a valuable thing to do, because people come and they engage with it, and they, you know, they talk about it, and they go away and they think about it. So, you know, exhibitions like this, artists like this, showing the things alongside each other is a very, very valuable thing to do. I presume we're going to go talk on about the input and the output aspect of it as well. But,
Good.
Well, you know, one of the features of the show is the fact that all of the artists were asked to choose something as some form of input to the creation of the artwork, and they interpreted that in very different ways. So Casey Reese, for instance, one of the other artists in the show, has these drawing instruments opposite his artwork. And one of the other artists has a series of books that with inspiration for the works, and so on. So, you know, you interpret the input and you interpret the output in different ways as well, not just literally in a computer sort of a sense. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, not at all. I find it my job somehow to try and sort of perhaps bring a kind of forced unity to your practices, which maybe isn't appropriate. But there are a couple of things that strike me as perhaps unifying. William, you talk about geometries, monochrome, color. I mean, generative art or painting or generative art is often very visually seductive. But of course also, you know, there's a big movement towards viewing the code itself as an art form. Where do you see? I think, and it's also, I think, Iskra, bringing Malevich into the conversation is obviously, I think, to take us back to a kind of age of modernist painting, which maybe was attempting to purify painting to its kind of purest form somehow. It doesn't seem strange to me to draw an analogy like that. But, you know, given that you guys also are specialists with code, perhaps you can enlighten us as to how you can get from coded language to visual seduction.
Wow. I think one thing to not forget is that generative art is art at the end, and the same codes apply. So you have the same rules, you know, like colors, theory, composition, contrast. At the end of the day, coding is just another tool. It's not something new. I mean, it's a new medium that allows us to go further, you know, as a human, because we can go way beyond our understanding as, you know, code or formulas, mathematics, and explore. And we step by step find similarities within the nature and the world. But I don't think generative art is, because it's with code, it has to look like something completely different than traditional art. And at the end of the day, it's just the artist that will translate his vision and understanding of art into the composition. So the code is not driving the art. It's always the artist driving the art. So we like to seduce. So we're gonna seduce.
Iskra, I think just staying with that, I want to come back to the idea that your work is comprises 5 lines of code. That might, to someone like me who's not perhaps the world's greatest coder, imply that you input the code and you get an output which you are more or less exactly expecting. But you also talk a lot about the process of and the role of chance in the process of producing the final output. Can you and I know this is something that William particularly is also I think agrees on. Can you just perhaps I always feel like loath asking artists to talk about their process, but is there a way that we should be thinking or writing about the process of producing the output rather than viewing it as a sort of input-output?
Well, I think the process is very relevant in what we do. The same way the process is relevant in every kind of art, as William said. In this case, it's 5 lines, 5 or 6, depending on what do you consider, styles or not. But it's 5 after like 1 year of iteration. So I went through a lot of different outputs and a lot of different lines. And after 1 year, I realized that just with this part of the code, I had something that I really liked. And it was not with these 5, I will know exactly what I will have. It just like after a lot of iteration on the code, I obtained something that was defined by these 5 or 6 lines. And I think the interesting thing in this algorithm is that in the same way I did that with different projects before, it's taking some clear algorithm done by myself or just an algorithm that someone else wrote before, and then destroyed until it just like disappears, and then something emerges from there. And this is something that I really do in my practice, destroying like everything, and then after several iterations, there is something that emerged from there. So in this code, I had this illusion of an eye, which is not an eye, but it's something that, at least for me, looks like an eye. And that's why I tried to express that in this grid of 4 steps, because it becomes the first one. If I play with the width, it would be a lake, and I have an algorithm that draws lakes. But if I rotate it, it starts to convert to an eye. So, and it's just depending on the grade of rotation, actually. So that's why this is only 1 line. And I think one of the parameters are like multiplying the rotation per 2000 or something. So it's not that I really knew that if I rotate 2000, I will obtain that. But just like after 1 year putting 2,200, 1 million, 3, so I obtained that. So, and then I said, okay, this is the thing that works. So yeah, I don't know, it's just like an approach. But in this project, the process is the main thing.
I'm conscious that you use, you talk about the organic quality, and that seems to be an area where you and Sofia actually have some affinity. I think Sofia as well, one of the striking things, talking about art made using programs and computing, is just how the conversation about non-human machine form moves very quickly to a conversation about the more than human, which is to say the natural form. And that's something that I think is quite striking to me. I mean, you talk about the eye, Iskra, but the idea of the close proximity of the natural and the machinic. And in this kind of period now where, code is a tool, as you say, like a paintbrush, a prosthetic, perhaps. Does it ever seem strange to you that, to bring natural forms and to reproduce them using machine intelligence? Because that's it creates a kind of uncanny set of species.
Well, it doesn't seem strange because that's exactly what I'm fascinated by. Actually, if anything, it feels very natural because it's, you know, when we started, like when painting kind of begun, well, you probably know this much better than I do, but like some of the very first subjects to ever be painted were creatures, things that people saw in the natural world. And in a way, like, I don't want to say the first things to ever be programmed were life forms, but to some extent, there is like a heavy inspiration of nature in math, and also like thematically. But I am biased because I am really fascinated by the artificial life kind of software movement, because artificial life extends to a lot of different practices, but particularly in software, it had its kind of boom in the 80s and 90s. And yeah, when I found out about this, I was like really shocked that it had kind of died out now and that it wasn't as prevalent anymore. But to me, it just feels like I don't see this clear boundary between nature and technology. Like, here is where it begins, here is where it ends, and we don't question a lot of things that we do. Like, we don't think of clothes as a technology every day, you know, like you don't brush your teeth thinking, oh, I'm using a technology right now, like, you know, and I don't run, like, when I'm using training a model, I don't think anymore, oh, I'm using a technology, because I do it so often. I'm sure that applies to you as well.
That one of the, I mean, I think guys sitting here and hearing conversations about you know, art and science, very kind of close proximity. I think there's a tendency to perhaps historically to view those fields as separate. I've recently hosted an artist and a scientist, which I'm going to publish soon. And one of the things that is eminently clear is that technology is the one thing that joins art and science. And of course, if you have, in a sense, if you can control the technology, then in a sense you can shape the space that is created out of that. And obviously, Malevich had a fear that technology, because of course it was, you know, given the age he was living in, technology only wrought destruction. But of course, you know, one of the privileges of being at the beginning of Web3 is that actually we have a chance to sort of wrest control of these technologies. And one of the things I think about, you know, artists, all of these artists, but in particular based on what Sofia was saying, is the idea that actually an artist is not just an artist anymore. An artist is a designer of new technologies. And usually they're the most socially progressive designers. And that's, you know, just one way in which I've justify myself on a daily basis, why I think art is not somehow autonomous or separate from reality. In many ways, it is actually actively shaping technology in a way which maybe it wasn't when it was allowed to remain within a kind of hallowed white cube, if that makes sense. Do you disagree, Douglas?
No, not at all, but there's also a long history to that one, of course, going again right the way back to the 1960s, where several artists did collaborate with scientists in various institutions around the world. Probably the best known one is called Bell Labs, Bell Telephone Laboratories, where several artists came in and were basically helping the scientists to understand what they could do with this new hardware and software that they were working with, and they brought something different to it, and, you know, wonderful things came out of it as a result, but it was because of that collaboration between the two. There are also one or two famous stories about scientists getting together and producing artworks and realizing that they had to conform to this sort of art and science paradigm where one of them had to be the artist and one of them had to be the scientist. So they would basically toss a coin and say, I'll be the artist and you can be the scientist on this one. But mostly it really was artists coming in and working with them and producing wonderful things. But going back to something else you were saying earlier, also there's a long history of scientists trying to understand how artists work. And the reason they were trying to understand how artists work was because they wanted to capture it and codify it. You know, how is it that this amorphous thing that these people over there do works so that we can program it. And they would do things like program artworks by known artists and try and emulate them and try and produce something that was similar to it. It wasn't the same, of course, but it was, an attempt to get towards it. So, famously, people looked at Bridget Riley, for example, and tried to copy the curves in some of her works, or Mondrian painting, trying to work out how all the lines went and the colors went, or maybe in black and white in those days. So, you see that a lot now with artificial intelligence and art, where people are starting with big data sets and trying to create something from them. In the early days, they were looking at a single painting and saying, how does that work? How can I codify it?
And also, William, the project that I think how I came to your work was Dragons, which is, is a really spectacular project. What is your relationship to the natural?
This project was quite interesting for me because it was the first time I was seeing my art like a live being, something that lives. And I try to, instead of putting my emotions into it, to create some life form that have personality. So it was a lot of studying, creatures and Pokemon, stuff like that, and how designers that make this kind of creatures, how do they think? What do they want to achieve? And I try to make a big soup and make that. So it was mostly about giving life through an image, and I don't want to draw some eyes and and some tail and a leg, but mostly, again, as an observer, what do you see? Because I do see that, but do you see it as well? And I try to see myself if life form, even abstract, can be conveyed. And I think it worked because a lot of people come to me and they're like, yeah, this one makes me think of this emotion or stars, and it's really interesting for me because it means through the artwork, a Pokemon, has been created, like a Tamagotchi, something like that, and a connection has been made through life, because it's not that we see it live, it's because we know nature and some stuff similar that we can connect to this art form. So that was the idea, to connect through life form.
But also, a project like Anticyclone, I think, looks very like hand drawings. And you specialize, it seems to me, in making born digital art look like it's made by hand. And I think texture is very important to you. But how do you sort of square the digital physical divide?
I like to make textures. Probably because I'm quite an obsessive person and I like to reproduce what I see. But I mostly see textures and not simulation, but a form of texture that will make you think about something as a link, as a connection. And for me, it's not about skeuomorphism or blah, 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 those kind of debates. It's more about connecting to the human from the other side of the screen. Like, what is my visual language to connect with someone else? And for me, because I practice a lot of with traditional paint and other mediums, my day-to-day media are physically, like, tangible, tactile, and for me, it's a way to connect with people. It just this, and then to make it with code is just like, to be obsessive with observation. Like, oh yeah, there's a small line here, there's a small ink, like, okay, let's make it in code, and hopefully it will connect with people.
But also, Iskra, you're known for your plotting. I wonder if you could just perhaps talk a little bit about the difference between producing an image for a digital display and to plot something out, which, of course, Douglas is really part of the canon of computer art.
Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Yeah, well, I plot sometimes. There is a reason why I started plotting. It was, well, I'll tell shortly the long story, but then the short one. The long one was, I'm really interested in translating my digital work to physical pieces, and I play with ceramics, and I really wanted to, my biggest project in life is trying to find my place between where I was born. I was born in Bulgaria, in one extreme of Europe, and then I grew up in Spain. So there is some kind of thing that I have inside of trying to understand physically where I am closer to. That's something that will take me a few decades to get into this question, but I wanted to start this research with playing with AI, training different shapes, different geometries from both cultures and so on. So that was like the first step to get there. And I bought a plotter because I wanted to create my designs and then draw it on the ceramics, which, well, I need more time to get into there, but that was the first thing that I thought when I bought the plotter. And then I just felt in love with the machine. There is something very interesting for me, because when you ask about the works, if they're different, if they're meant to be plotted or not, my digital work is super intense in lines and in very thin lines, and I just cannot plot that. I tried sometimes, but I just break the paper and the pen and the table and everything, so it's impossible. So if I want to do something with a plotter, I just need to design it in a different way. But there is something, and that's the most important thing, that I realized with the plotter is, because my process comes always with this distraction of all the algorithms and everything, it happened to me that sometimes I just see the output and I say, okay, I like it. I don't know how it happened. So it's something that I really need to understand better. And then if I start plotting this thing, it will take maybe 2 days or 3 days on finishing the plot. But if I look at the process, I would say line by line how the machine thinks. And this is something that helps me a lot to understand better my process, but also to slow down a bit. Because when we create something with an algorithm and you create a long-form project, which is this, with 1,000 outputs or whatever we decide to close, the work, it's addictive because you can just refresh the browser and you'll get every day 300 pieces. And this is something that it's complicated to understand in terms of time and creation. But if you plot something, it will take more time and you can just enjoy and understand, in a different way how time goes, So the plotter is something that I use it to create, but also to think or to relax a bit, to understand, so yeah, it's part of the process.
And finally, Sofia, do you have any views on the physical-digital relationship?
I have comments about what all of you said. First of all, like plotters are a whole world of their own. At some point, I thought like, oh, I'm just gonna repurpose this 3D printer onto a plotter. I was like, it was the worst idea I ever had. I hated plotters after that. So I could never actually bring myself to use the plotter, so I only use it in collaboration projects where somebody else is doing that. It's just a small comment. Then I was gonna comment on what William said about the Tamagotchi, because I love, I remember when I was a kid, my classmates had Tamagotchis, and I remember this thing of having feelings for it and feeling bad if it died or if it was starving. And later on, I mean, I started to think about like all this, I say like it's kind of baggage or emotional baggage that we throw onto nature. You know, we say this creature feels this way. But very often that's kind of like a reflection of how we feel. So we think like, oh, this dog is happy, or this thing, like this snail must be happy. Because it's very hard to tell, you know, with a snail. They don't have the same face as we do. And with plants, like they don't have faces. Like there's no interface directly to connect to, you know, a kind of emotionality. So yeah, that's something that I think about like very often, how in art you also kind of throw a lot of emotional baggage onto it. Very often it's just like a personal thing, you know, this thing makes me happy today, this thing made me really sad. And lastly, I was going to talk about like what you mentioned about engineers trying to make like, I recently had an engineer tell me like, oh, what if you train a Sofia Crespo generator on all your like body of work and just generate new artworks? And I was like, yeah, but like there is no way that that model could anticipate what I want to do next. Like, could you actually summarize your life? Like, could you do that? Like something that's meant to be experienced? It's very hard to like remove that and say, you know, creating an accurate model that's actually going to predict that. One thing is to create an AI that can play chess or can play Go, but actually how do you create an AI that will predict the next artistic movement? Like that's, to me at least, that seems like a lot more complex. So it doesn't have a set of defined rules. Maybe there are patterns, but there aren't tangible rules. Well, so those are.
I think I'm probably going to draw the conversation to a conclusion, but I think what's quite striking hearing all of your different thoughts is that I think, from a personal perspective, I think your work all sits on a spectrum. William, you talk about how the code is a tool, but when I think, Sofia, about your work, it seems to me it's much more, the machine seems to me more of a collaborator than just a mere tool, or not at all, no.
Like,
Yeah.
we're talking about AI, that's just my personal point of view.
Well,
like,
I'm allowed my opinion too. Okay. I think what's striking about the way Sofia and all of you talk about the work, I think, is that I think it used to be when we talk about painting or modernist painting, there was this kind of cult of the great artist making marks, making a mark on the world, etc., etc. But what's quite striking, it seems to me, is that when you talk about non-human and natural forms, machine and natural forms, so prominently, it says to me that we're dealing with not so much of an anthropocentric art world. We're dealing with an art world in which the human is just one part of perhaps a collaborative or other creative process. So for me, it's not always easy to process the language. And I always think, you know, we ask a lot of artists to talk for hours and hours in IRL, but also on Twitter Spaces endlessly about their work. You know, it does speak for itself. But I think it also is more than just a kind of hallowed white cube, as I said before. I think it does also represent a world which could be better, and also a real world, not just an imaginary better world.
Is Midjourney generative art? That's a good question, I think, first to ask. As the definition of generative art today for me is that the human has a huge input into the algorithm. So as long as the human has this input, it will be really hard to mimic this. Obviously, you can ask, I don't know, someone sitting on a chair in a beautiful house, and it will output this. But if you want to have your voice, basically, I think you can't avoid to craft your art. So I'm not sure. I don't think it will replace or take jobs of anyone. Maybe the most the quickest, the fastest to produce. Like draw me a square. Yeah, an AI can do that. But if you ask someone to interpret a song or I don't know something really deep as human, I really doubt that an AI can do that alone. You have to train the AI. It will be biased on your assumptions and your beliefs. So as is, I think you remain the artist, and the AI didn't take your job. It's just a partner to go further. But yeah, it's a blurry line, I would say. Like it won't take jobs, but maybe some.
I mean, I just didn't want to start a rant. That's why I'm trying to keep myself contained. But I hear that very often with AI, like, aren't you scared? I think it's very often like when there's new technologies, so it's like this fear reaction that comes with it. But I understand it completely because it's like suddenly this is meant to change a lot of the way we do things. So like maybe some work, just some jobs actually change.
But I think like it's part of every technology transition. Like some jobs go away to have new ones. It's not necessarily a bad thing that some jobs go away because we can focus on the next things for the humanness. So yeah, it's not really replacing, it's just evolving, basically for me at least. Oh yeah, yeah. DALL-E, yeah.
I'm more familiar with DALL-E really, but because I'm interested in the history of this stuff, and as I say, one of the first artists to experiment with artificial intelligence was this guy called Harold Cohen. I thought I would try and make DALL-E make a Harold Cohen, and try and emulate an Harold Cohen, and it wasn't having it. It wasn't very keen. It took me quite a few goes to get anything like Harold Cohen work coming out of it. And I think, as one of you said earlier on, how does it predict the next art movement rather than the previous one? Because all of these things are so premised on prior knowledge, previous activity, rather than future activity. So that's the bit of it that I struggle with, really.
Well, I think it's a long thing to talk about, the same way that you said. In terms of if people is going to lose the works, the jobs, I think this is something that it's really interesting, and we talk a lot about this. I think for me, it's clear it's not going to happen this. Like I think everyone mentioned, with every new technology, that we have this debate like for the last whole life. And I mean, like photography and drawing, did the drawing die? No, because it's a different thing. But I think there is something very interesting comparing both situations. Because for me, everything is about information. And when you are a painter and then, we invent photography, it's a new art, but also a new source of information for the painter. For example, someone that cannot travel to the other side of the world because can just, but you have a photograph of some different country and you draw that. So this is something that today the technology is bringing to us, this new spectrum of new worlds that you can draw them. So I think it's not about losing things, but adapting and dealing with these new things. This is related to this. And the new applications, I think, as always happen, and this is to close a bit with the first thing that we said about this mix of science and art. I think there is something, they just go in the same direction. That there is a loop of dreamers, which are the artists, and then ground, I don't know in English how it's like, scientists are like, this is not going to happen, because this is not possible. But then the dreamers push, and then the scientists, at the end, they say, okay, yeah, it was possible, but we have to go slower, right? So it's a loop of advancing things further. And these kind of new tools, they're not maybe any more sexy because everyone can use them as a tool, but always in history, when more people goes into something, there is a competition, and in this competition is where things happen and where people push things forward. So I don't know when this will become art, if everyone is using the tool, but I'm sure it will just naturally come to us. At some point, this will be like, it's not about the tool. Someone created something incredibly beautiful, and it's art. So, I don't know.
I have a comment on your comment. I think there's a really good point in what you say, is that with AI, I think everyone is, with the tools like Midjourney and DALL-E, everyone has a voice and can make imagery. And from the beginning of humanity, imagery communicates with the world, and I think it's just good. I think it's not a bad thing that enabling people to talk visually. I think it's just a good thing, not bad.
Well, I can start. Well, with at least like fellow artists who use AI as a tool, like Helena Sarin, who's also here in this show. We talk about the issue that everyone thinks our work is made with DALL-E or Midjourney or Stable Diffusion, and it's funny, like every time there's a new kind of particular trend in AI, many people think that if you're making art with AI, you're probably using that particular technique. Like when GANs were mainstream, then suddenly everybody thought that all the work with AI was done with GANs. And I was like, no, I'm actually using another kind of convolutional neural network. And what I particularly love is that there are many different types of architectures in AI. There are many different types of algorithms that you can use. And I think that's really like what makes it so fascinating. But it's hard to explain that, like, because it's beyond my control and my reach to the general public. So yeah, yeah.
Just to make sure I answer your question, it's about which are our thoughts about. Yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of debates in this area. Yeah, I mean, what are we doing in the space? What is this going? I mean, what's the connection between this movement? I really believe there is a movement in art here, but what's the relationship with the NFTs? What's the relationship with the crypto space? What's the relationship with those huge amounts of money that they are moving around? And this is about art or a new economy behind all these things. So I think there are a lot of debates which goes beyond the art itself, and in terms of what we talk with, in my case, with my friends, with the people around, I think they are not so happy with my activity now, and I'm not sure why. There is some kind of resistance to really believe that this is something that belongs to completely to the art world, and I am sure it's because of this fear of technology. This answering again your question about that this is coming, to just give us our jobs, and so I think there are a lot of debates that, yeah, just go beyond the art itself, and questions about our thing, our art. I think it's the same debate that
you were the other day, we were in a panel, and you said, I'm calling myself a computational artist now. And I thought that was really interesting because, like, I say that artists don't often get to choose maybe this is a very polemic opinion, but artists don't often get to choose the art movement that they're part of. That gets decided afterward. So even if you resist, you might end up being remembered as that. And I thought that was interesting that you're calling it like different way. Like I really resisted the term AI. I didn't want to call myself an AI artist. And I still don't want to call myself an NFT artist. I have so many things to say, which I'm not going to say.
We just started something interesting here.
Not a thing. Yeah, it has to disappear.
Thank you.
Yeah, just artists. Yeah. I think as a generative artist, a lot of struggle is, I think, is no, because we got this question with Iskra one time, like, what's the point of what you're doing? And you're like, I don't know, man, I don't know. Because we're constantly, searching for a purpose of doing that. So it's not totally defined. And because we are in we are currently living the movement, so it's really hard for us to see where it goes. We just go, basically, and we struggle on the way, and we ask ourselves, what are we doing? And a lot of time, people come to me and are like, what's the point of you doing this? It looks like you just draw a square on the screen. I'm like, yeah, but it's not as easy. This is not the main point of drawing the square. So yeah, it's all about like beyond the output. It's what we wanna communicate and what we wanna do with coding. And yeah, it's a very difficult question for me.
Thinking about this conversation we had, I don't know, in Portugal maybe, yeah. We talk about this, and I think we have a very interesting question from the audience, and we have a super interesting audience there. They were from the traditional art world.
You're a good audience too.
Actually the same. I mean, sometimes, not so interesting as this one, I would say. But sometimes we're in a very close circle talking about our things, and this event was, was one of the first events that we had this great audience, and they asked us about, that's great, you do digital art, and that's super cool, but we don't see the concept behind that, and we don't see a protest or something, and I think it will come with the time. I feel just. There are too many things happening, so we cannot be everywhere or something like that. But I just really see there is something arising, which is a very interesting topic. And what's the relationship with the machine? And that's something that first we have to really understand how the tools work, and then we can go in this direction. But there is a hard question there. What we will be able to give to the machine? What can we take from the machine? How can our relationships with ourselves and the other and the society, how we shape the society with the machine? So there are many, many relevant questions behind that, which is a strong concept, I think. But we are not yet there. But yeah, that's something that I think it's interesting.
And I think, I agree, it will take time, and also because most of people don't understand what we do, like we work with code, and most of people are not tech savvy, so it's really hard to explain the process, and because it's what's important in art, it's really hard for us to sometimes define ourselves as artists, because other people don't see us as artists as well. And yeah, it's really a struggle, but I see a lot, in traditional world.
Finally, we have to finish, but I think the principle of right-click save is very much, without the hype that we've had for so long, why are we here? And it seems to me evenings like this are important because we have this moment, which may be a once-in-a-lifetime moment for the artists to dictate the terms by which their work is evaluated in a critical sense, rather than someone else who doesn't understand completely.
Thank you, everyone. And if you haven't had a chance, the show is downstairs as well, and it will be on till the 16th of October, as well as if you haven't had a chance tonight. And we just wanted to thank you, and thank you to the panelists and Alex for moderating. And if you have any other questions, please let us know, and we'll continue this conversation. And thank you, everyone.